For once, both science and government came together to produce a nearly magical vaccine in record-setting time that probably could have stopped the pandemic months ago and by ceasing its transmission, but also at the same time halting these vexing mutations, which have put us more or less here in January of 2022, right back where we were in March of 2020. We endured the frightening and unknown in 2020, so that we welcome 2021 like the American troops arriving in Paris to drive out the Nazis, when we were able to get the world-altering vaccine in our arms, just 2 jabs away from freedom. And I'll tell you, I did feel invincible for a few weeks before it became obvious that having a vaccine available is not the same thing as being able to administer it to the majority of the population. We have now crossed the unthinkable line of more than 800,000 American deaths from the pandemic, with, ironically, more dying in 2021 than have died in 2020, even though most of the deaths in the past year were entirely preventable, if only people had generally been willing to follow the basic observances of wearing a mask in public, maintaining some distance, getting the vaccine, and the all-important booster shot when it was first available. How the vaccine and wearing masks became a political watershed will be the subject of conversation among armchair sociologists for years, as well as any number of PhD dissertations. My fellow Ozarkers here in Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, by generally refusing the vaccine and denying the existence of COVID-19, gave the Delta variant the fertile place it needed to grow and multiply. And I'm not bragging when I tell you that my hillbilly neighbors managed to give the entire world the most virulent strain of the virus, at least until the last few weeks. As we work our way through the Greek alphabet to the less well-known letters, we are now on the threshold, if not in the middle of, a new spike of Omicron. Initial research out of Britain suggests that this variant may be 5 times as infectious as the Delta variant, and apparently it is nearly unaffected by the simple 2-dose vaccine regimen that most of us went through back in the spring. And it's not stopped often enough with a booster shot. We are now going into a long and dangerous winter when people are already tired of COVID protocols if they ever actually observe them. So I ask you, what has made the difference between the people who have been socially responsible and have done what they can to slow or to stop the spread of the virus, and those who have defiantly behaved in ways that makes it look rather like they are in the part-time or maybe the full-time employment of COVID-19? Let me offer this caveat. Neither theology nor psychology are exact sciences. Both are fraught with speculation, projection, and a few unsupported opinions. And as Mark Twain is famous for saying, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. So what I'm going to share with you today are some of my conclusions about the current state of humanity. What I have to say is well-reasoned, very well-researched, and can be supported by statistics, data, and lots of footnotes. However, I know my audience, and it goes without saying that intelligent and rational people may disagree with some or all of my conclusions. That's the contract that we share with one another. I get the microphone for a few minutes, and then you get to decide what is useful, and if you can do us both a favor and dismiss everything that you're convinced is wrong. For those of us who are no longer a part of traditional Christianity or Judaism or Islam, those of us who have chosen to continue some religious or spiritual life without being dogmatic about it. At least most of us have accepted that faith is a matter of how we see and interact with the world, rather than how we deny the world's relevance. We very often find ourselves having to explain ourselves to people who are still locked in the cage of heaven and hell and supernatural theism, explaining to them why we still go to church at all. As one person recently asked me, "How come you're still preaching when you don't believe anything?" What does it mean to be spiritual when you have given up on superstition and when you no longer engage in magical thinking? As is true of many of the Unitarian congregations where I'm invited to speak around the country, our internet audience is comprised of people who might describe themselves as being progressive Christians or progressive Jews or Muslims, but it seems like the largest group in many UU churches are humanists, or perhaps more like me, kind of a humanist with a plus sign, which is how I like to describe panentheism. But many of you, I know, are just flat-footed atheists, and yet we are all trying to find connection somehow within a spiritual community. At least I hope you are. Never let a YouTube channel become all of your church. Everyone should find their tribe. While it is nice to identify ourselves and our objectives by talking about our practices and our beliefs, it's also helpful to think about it in terms of its negation. That is, we can say what we are, but it is also helpful to say what we most certainly are not. What is the opposite of a spiritual life? I don't want to oversimplify this, but for discussion's sake, there's two kinds of people in the world, the kind that divide the world into two groups and the people that don't. But more than that, I just want to look at spirituality in juxtaposition to sociopathy. And in many ways, our current pandemic gives us the perfect illustration. 2 years ago, as the world was waking up to this awful reality of a looming pandemic, we were encouraged to avoid being in crowds. Eventually, we were all encouraged to wear masks in public and to obsessively wash our hands, then sanitize everything until the whole world smelled like rubbing alcohol and bleach. Immediately, the world was divided between those who wanted to comply with COVID protocols and those who just adamantly refused to be bothered by any of it. We've seen these videos of fights that break out on commercial aircraft where someone is refusing to wear a mask and then calls everyone else on board the plane sheep, as they are drug off in handcuffs. There was a lot of misinformation in the early days. There was some silly politicizing of the whole pandemic. But as time went on, it became evident to everyone that even though younger and more healthy people generally, though not always, fared pretty well with the virus, older folks and people with underlying conditions as common as being somewhat overweight or being a type 2 diabetic, those people were dying by the hundreds of thousands. Then, as the vaccine became broadly available to Americans, we had a full set of methods for defeating the virus and bringing the pandemic to an end. But that miracle cure, those safety measures, involved people who were not personally afraid of the virus still being vaccinated and choosing to wear masks and to avoid crowds to protect all the rest of us who were at greater risk. In the part of the world where I live, the majority of people never were willing to wear a mask or maintain a safe distance. And when the vaccines were being distributed, I and some of my church folks found it easy to get in line to be vaccinated the very first week, because most of the people that were supposed to be at the head of the line just refused to get the jab. Unimaginably, it became a part of daily conversation in neighborhoods and office settings, certainly in church. People who undeniably knew that their personal decision to not be vaccinated, to continue to go in public unmasked, might indirectly cause the deaths of many other people. But here's the point. They didn't care. They didn't care. This was inexplicable. To me, it's disgusting. To most of us who assume that public health is a total society responsibility, these people are unimaginably outside of society. For the same reason that I don't pour old, used oil from my car or pesticides or cleaning chemicals into the sewer, I wouldn't dream of haphazardly spreading, or at least potentially spreading, a lethal virus. When I was in grad school in the 1980s, we were told that 4 or 5% of society were sociopaths, maybe 6 or 7% of CEOs of corporations. The pandemic and a lot of the racism and sexism so plainly displayed during the Trump administration brought me to the painful belief that I could see distinct sociopathy in nearly 50% of society. And sadly, I have to say, in maybe 85% of the Ozarks. So here's the contrast I'm drawing for us today. Bearing in mind that neither theology nor psychology are exact sciences, but I'm using these terms to try to interpret our current circumstances. I love the way that the late Marcus Borg summed up who he said the historical Jesus was. He described Jesus of Nazareth as being the teacher of radical compassion. Once you strip away the layers of editing by later generations, Jesus was not some kind of God on a stick who liberates the elect from hell, but rather he was the one who showed unexpected and undeserved compassion to the outcasts of society. And one of our favorite authors, who was a peer of Borg's in the Jesus Seminar, Karen Armstrong, saw that this emphasis on compassion towards the weak and the marginalized was also at the core of the historical genesis of most of the other world religions. Issuing in her invitation to the whole world, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, to sign on to her 12-step charter for compassion that becomes the spiritual path for making the world a better place. What I would like to add to this is that beyond Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Zoroastrians, we hear a very similar sentiment being articulated by physicists. My favorite, probably not anywhere near the world's leading physicist, but the one that I think I can understand, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who famously has said, "We are all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, and to the universe atomically." This awareness makes me realize that as a spiritual person, a fully vaccinated, boosted, and recently COVID-tested spiritual person, I still wear a mask in public and avoid close proximity in closed spaces to others who may be more vulnerable to the infection than I am. In contrast, a sociopath, feeling no connection to the outcomes of their actions, may refuse to be vaccinated or to follow any COVID protocols because, as callous as it sounds, being inconvenienced personally is a larger concern to them than the prospect of the possible deaths of vulnerable people all around him, her, or them. Now, this gets to be more difficult because officially, at least according to the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there isn't actually a diagnosis of sociopathy. Rather, the DSM uses sociopathy to describe a range of personalities that includes things like the antisocial personality and narcissism, particularly malignant narcissism. If you look at this slide, most people in prison have, to a greater or lesser degree, a kind of antisocial personality. They do not conform to social norms, and frankly, they don't understand why you do. They don't understand why anybody would. They lie as easy as all the rest of us can breathe. They tend towards violence within their family and among others because breaking laws means nothing to them. Whereas the narcissist on the other side may similarly have little regard for social norms and a near total lack of a capacity for empathy. And when I say that, I mean they literally can't feel empathy. They don't understand the emotion. But narcissists do love themselves, and they don't want to go to jail. And they do want to be in charge of the world, which means tricking you into believing that they have empathy. They will use people, they will exploit them, but they are less likely to stab them or steal from them unless, of course, the use of charm, manipulation, gaslighting, seduction can be called what it often is, stealing. A narcissist may run without any qualifications for President of the United States. And an antisocial person might run over you while driving drunk and blame you for being out in the streets. But neither of them is the least bit concerned with whether or not they give you COVID-19, or whether you have access to health care, or access to education for that matter, or decent housing. I am trying to create these two categories in our minds, that spiritual people are, by definition, compassionate people who are deeply and profoundly aware of their connection to everyone else. Sociopaths are people who are radically self-focused, who, if they ever felt empathy for anyone who was not in their very narrowly defined family or tribe, they've suppressed it, abandoned it, forgotten it. So why bring it up? And here I'm going to have to rely on a statement that may be more faith than fact, a truth claim of sorts. I try to avoid those, but this is one that I have cherished for 40 years. It's from Henry David Thoreau. He said, "I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of a person to elevate his or her or their life by conscious endeavor." That you can choose it. That is, you may have been born a sociopath. We say, I slept like a baby, but not many of us scream and cry for someone to bring us something to eat in the middle of the night. But we may have been born as sociopaths, but you can choose a spiritual life. So who are we going to be in 2022? How will our race survive the challenges of not just the pandemic, but income disparity, unequal, unjust distribution of health care, including vaccines, along with all of the other social ills that come with hoarding and greed? I believe that that answer is a spiritual answer, and one that begins with the choices we make about who we want to be. It was my good fortune to be a Merrill Fellow at Harvard Divinity School in the fall of 2004. I was taking a course in world religions under the famous scholar Diana Eck. And during that course, she invited the Buddhist scholar Lama Migmar to answer questions during our study of Buddhism. And he sat there. I was in the second row. He just sat there the whole hour looking very much like this picture as we pilloried him with questions about Buddhism and its slow acceptance of people of different sexual orientation, of China's control of Tibet, the safety of the Dalai Lama. And of course, it was 2004. We had just invaded Iraq. We'd been in Afghanistan for 3 years. So we asked him lots of questions about his feelings about 9/11 and the American wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, from the content of his answers, it was obvious that he was very well informed and deeply concerned about these and many other profound ethical situations. And yet he just had this grin on his face the whole time. Did he think that our questions were juvenile? Did we seem like we were shallow to him? Were we funny to him? You have to be pretty self-confident to just smile your way through being questioned by a room full of Harvard graduate students, no matter who you are. He told us that Buddhist teachers choose to smile, no matter what's going on. They choose to give a smile as a gift to the world. Yes, there is terrorism. There's the looming threat that comes from superpowers, military occupation, cultural prejudices, poverty, and on and on and on. But the spiritual master chooses to bless the world with a smile, which outside of the heady narcissism of a Harvard grad school classroom may be generally received as a sign of kindness, of acceptance, and even of love. Spirituality, friends, is not a denial of reality. It is not an emphasis of otherworldly concerns. There is no virtue in turning off the news so that you can be uninformed. Not being aware is nothing to brag about. I think it's something to be ashamed of. It amounts to a smug indifference towards the suffering of others. But to be aware and to choose to respond with kindness, to suspend judgment, to telegraph acceptance even to the unacceptable, to even love people who are basically unlovable, even if it's just through a smile. That's what it means to be spiritual. Lama Migmar explained, to grow in the Buddhist way is to move from intellect into faith, turning blind faith into wisdom faith. Who are we going to be in this coming year? If we are simply religious in an otherworldly kind of way, escaping into magical thinking about heaven or some reality comprised of unseen spirits, whether they are angels or leprechauns, muses or the Loch Ness Monster, then I fear we are choosing, as faith communities, first irrelevance and almost certainly extinction. We do not seek out a spiritual life to deny reality. I'm suggesting that we delve into it deeper, understanding science, economics, sociology, psychology, history. But no matter how woke we may become, no matter how wise and informed we may be, we do not allow ourselves to simply become smug and cynical, because cynicism leads to individualism, isolation, narcissism, and, I believe, sociopathy. I'm pleading with you to be informed so that you can move from intellect to faith, from blind faith to wisdom faith, so that you can afford to give the world your kindness, your understanding, your acceptance, and your love, even with a smile. That's who I hope we will be in this stressful year of a third year of global pandemic, with a reignited Cold War and still a dying planet we never seem to want to talk about. There are things about which those who are awake will be very angry, but I'm asking you not to wallow in that. Turn your anger into energy for action in a world waiting to be saved from its most base instincts, and do it in kindness and in love.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.